Got it.
Thank you for joining the Judaism Demystified podcast. In the opening chapter of your book, Maimonides Confrontation with Mysticism, you characterize the vision and values of Maimonides promoted in his understanding of Judaism, as well as the cultural climate he campaigned against. Can you outline for us the Maimonidean vision of Judaism, as well as the cultural context he found himself trying to uproot?
Okay. I like to tell my students that Halevi was such a great prophet that he foresaw the Rambam. Maimonides. Can I continue saying Rambam?
Of course, you could say whatever you want. Well, our audience understands both. So
yeah, okay, fine. That Halevi wrote the Kuzari against Rambam. Now, I'm not serious about that. Historically, it's not the case. But if you ask me what was the kind of Judaism that Rambam was seeking to uproot, I would say to a very great extent it was the Judaism which we find in Halevi's Kuzari, with a lot of other things. But the point of the book that you just mentioned is to say that a good way to understand what Rambam is trying to do is to fight against elements in the Jewish tradition which later on, afterwards, so to speak, came out from the subterranean rivers in which they had flowed for a long time out into the public. And the Rambam was seeking to fight those elements of the tradition that had developed to his day. And that's a good way of seeing a lot of things that he does. So in the book, I think that you mentioned, is 7 chapters, and they all revolve around this idea. What is the idea? What is he trying to uproot? Well, briefly, Rambam was a rationalist in the sense that he followed Aristotle in accepting the definition of human beings as rational animals. The genus of which we are members is animals, mosquitoes, octopi, whatever you want. But the specific difference which distinguishes us from all the other animals is the fact that we can be rational. Now, the moment you adopt that definition of what a human being is, you are committed to a wide variety of positions that people like Yehuda Halevi and afterwards Kabbalah, which is much more extreme than Halevi ever was, you're committed to views that these streams would reject. This underlies Rambam's extreme universalism. The Torah says that God created human beings in the image of God, and the Torah wasn't kidding. That's Rambam's view, I think. That's like his universalism, namely that human beings are human beings. And as opposed to Halevi and Kabbalah and Chassidut and most of my fellow Orthodox Jews today, there is nothing that distinguishes Jews from Gentiles up front. There's no ontological, mystical, spiritual, there's nothing. There's not the Inyan Elohi of Halevi, there's not the Pintle Yud in Yiddish, there's not the Neshama Yehudit. They're just human beings. And Jews are distinguished from non-Jews not by my friend Danny Lasker from New York University likes to use the following analogy. Rambam distinguishes Jews from non-Jews by their software, not by their hardware. And Yehuda Halevi distinguishes Yehuda Halevi, and after him, again, I emphasize he's much more moderate than what happened afterwards. Halevi distinguishes Jews from non-Jews by virtue of their hardware. It's something built in. And now, this one does make a lot of sense to you guys are too young to realize this, but when personal computers first came out, everybody wanted to get the best possible computer, which was built by IBM. And other computers were considered clones, and they weren't as good. They didn't even run that well. But it was always easy. Once you bought an IBM computer, you could change the software easily. You buy a new program and install it, and you've got the same machine. The hardware is running, but a different program. That's a useful way of understanding what Rambam's universalism. Human beings all have the same hardware. But there's a program called Torah that Jews run. But anybody who runs that program is therefore by definition a Jew, which is why Rambam makes conversion, relatively speaking, simple and possible. Look, for Halevi, conversion really isn't possible. What you can become is in effect, a second-class Jew. You will never attach yourself to the Inyan Elohi. You will never achieve prophecy. These are all theoretical differences for Levi. There weren't a lot of prophets running around in his day either. But all these are elements of Rambam's universalism, which I think are a function of his acceptance of the Torah, and in this case, Aristotle's definition of what a human being is. So this is like one aspect of, pardon me, one aspect of the world, the Jewish world that Rambam was fighting against. Now, the ironic thing is that by making these positions so clear and so emphatic, Rambam raised against him all kinds of, well, let's just put it this way. Rambam's emphatic universalism and rationalism, in effect, promoted the rise of Kabbalah.
Right.
Now, I'll give you one more example of what we're talking about here. According to Yehuda Halevi, the world was created by God using the Hebrew language. And the Torah says that, right? By Yor, God spoke, as it were. And in what language did he speak? It wasn't Yiddish, it wasn't Moroccan, it wasn't Parsi, it was Hebrew. So Halevi is convinced that the Hebrew language is unique among all languages, and it is uniquely fit for communicating spiritual ideas and thoughts and communication with God. Prophecy takes place in Hebrew by people who speak Hebrew properly, without an American accent like I have, and that no other language is as perfect as Hebrew is. Now, Rambam thinks that languages are languages. This is a debate that goes back to the Greek philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, in various ways of making this point, but there are those who thought that language is natural, and those who thought it was conventional. Halevi thinks that Hebrew is a natural language. It was created by God and implanted in Adam HaRishon, the first Adam. Rambam thinks that Hebrew is a conventional language. He goes so far as to say, why is Hebrew called the holy language? Because there are no words in it for disgusting things.
Right, it's not vulgar.
It's not vulgar. It's very Victorian. Now, Ramban, Maimonides, thinks that's crazy, and there's a long passage in his commentary on the Torah where he brings all kinds of examples of the Hebrew being vulgar. Yeah. But in any event, I like to point out that one of the ways in which Rambam's vision is useful to us, and hopefully I'm speaking for you guys as well, is that biblical Hebrew is, in contemporary terms, an extremely chauvinist language. I don't want to go into examples because some of them are vulgar. But think of the Hebrew word for female and what it means. Or for that matter, husband, which is the same thing as owner, master, and Canaanite god. I want to give you many more examples. If you buy into the Halevi / Kabbalah / Hasidut / contemporary Orthodox view of Hebrew as a divine language, it's very hard not to be a misogynist. And among all the medieval, not that the Rambam was not a contemporary feminist by any means, but he thought that women were created in the image of God, which in his day was not commonly accepted. My good friend Rabbi Levi ben Gershom Ralbag, 1288 to 1344, didn't read Darwin, of course, but if you recall, when Darwin published The Origin of Species, people said, okay, you claim that we are descended from apes, but we have apes and we have human beings. Where's the connecting link? And people spoke about the missing link between apes and human beings. Ralbag found the missing link between apes and human beings, women. So this is an example of the kind of thought. I'm not saying that Halevi or every Mikubal holds that view, but it was certainly common in the Middle Ages, and Rambam clearly rejected it. So these are many of the examples of the way in which the Judaism which he confronted was a Judaism which was not rationalist in the sense that it believed in kind of mystical illumination. For Halevi, you had to be able to contact, so to speak, what he called the Inyan Elohi, the divine something. If you didn't speak Hebrew, you couldn't really speak to God or hear God back. And by Hebrew, he means biblical Hebrew, not the Hebrew, not of the Mishnah, certainly not of the medievals. So that it forces Jews into a kind of hyper-particularism, which is very common these days. Can I give one more example?
Sure.
Okay. This is something which I was aware of in the book, but I've become ever more aware of it since I've gone on to other things. It turns out there's a machloket, a controversy in rabbinic literature over the nature of halakha, of Jewish law. Are the specific commandments, do they reflect some kind of antecedent ontological reality, or do they create social reality? Look, you have two hot dogs, and one is kosher and one is treif. You should, in principle, be able to develop a machine like a Geiger counter that would enable you to distinguish between them. Because the kosher hot dog is kosher not because of the laws of kashrut, but because the universe is built such that this is kosher. A better example, perhaps, is the whole notion of ritual purity and impurity, tara v'tumah. I like to tell my students that if we could invent a tumamometer, a Geiger counter that discovers tumah, then according to most Jews today, if you had the wand go over, I don't know, something that's tameh, impure, it would go click, 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 click. Now, I think it's fairly easy to show Rambam didn't accept any of these things. Halakha is what we would call today a game, a serious game, but it has rules. And the rules could have been different. That's the most important thing. It could have been different if Jewish history had been different. I can give you endless examples, but I'll give you a simple one. Observant Jews do not wear clothing made of linen and wool, right? Shatnez. Why not?
Because pagan priests would wear this.
Yes.
Because
that would not have happened. Yeah.
Because pagan priests wore linen and wool specifically. Now, had they worn polyester as opposed to linen and wool, then according to Rambam, shatnez would be permissible, but polyester would not be.
Correct.
Yeah.
And therefore, this goes against so many views that we're familiar with from our communities. Now, this is not to say that Rambam didn't observe the laws carefully. He took it very seriously. His, you might say, philosophy of mitzvot is different from the people around him. But this is also a function of the fact that you don't have to be Jewish to do these things. You don't have to have a Jewish soul. You have to accept the rules of the game and play according to them. And that obviously has important social consequences. It's not as if nothing happened. I keep getting on. I'll go on one more example about this.
You can go on with endless examples if you'd like. There's no rush.
I don't want to get, the three of us, you two and me, have been subjected to lots of rabbinic sermons over the years. And rabbis have a tendency not to know when to finish. I'm sure you've seen that happen a lot. I don't want to be guilty of that myself. But let's say you inadvertently violate a law, a halakha. Now, in certain cases, you have to bring a sacrifice called a korban shgaga. Okay, say yes.
Yes.
Yep.
Thank you. Now, why do you have to bring a korban shgaga? Ramban, Moshe ben Nachmanides, says it's because if a Jew sins, it damages her soul. some kind of stain on the soul. And by bringing this sacrifice, you manage to cleanse the soul of that stain. Now, Rambam, Maimonides says the reason why you bring a sacrifice is like why you're fined if you go, in your case, if you speed on the Long Island Expressway.
Right.
You're too busy to do anyway, but let's say you speed on Long Island Expressway, you get a ticket, and you pay for the ticket. And why are you paying? What is the ticket meant to do?
To penalize you to not do it again, basically.
Exactly. So
Yes.
Rambam says a korban shkaga is so we will take more care the next time. We had to pay a lot of money. We bought an animal. We had to bring it to the mikdash, to the temple. So therefore, we're learning our lesson. It's not that there's something that happens to our soul when we sin. We shouldn't sin, but if we do sin, the korban is not there to cleanse the soul. It's to give us an educational experience, not to sin again. This is one more example of this entire attitude towards halakha as a series of, you might call them institutions. You know, what I've learned since I wrote that book, it came out a long time ago, 2006, I think, is that this machloket between Rambam and Sneha Levi, or Rambam and Kabbalah, or Rambam and Chassidut, or Rambam and almost every Orthodox rabbi today, is found already in Chazal, in the rabbinic sages. And there's an awful lot of discussion about that in the scholarly world today, trying to argue that some Chazal agree in effect with Rambam, and others agree in effect with Yehuda Levi. It's interesting to point out that one of the most important scholars dealing with this subject is herself not Jewish, Christine Hayes from Yale University.
Oh, we love her.
We love her. Yeah.
We want her on. We haven't been able to.
I'll be seeing her in June. There's some kind of an issue here in Jerusalem where we're judging something together. In any event, I'll try and push the idea. She's very fine.
Please.
Please.
Speak of Judaism demystified her.
Yeah. She's a very fine scholar, and she's one of the important people dealing with the subject in terms of Chazal. I thought this was a machloket, a controversy just in the Middle Ages. I didn't realize it goes way back into rabbinic literature. Anyway, so that's like, you asked me one question, the world that the Rambam came from and that he was trying to, I would say, purify, disenchant.
Okay, so I wanted to ask a couple of things, or it's actually you brought in the institution of Halakha, which was actually going to be the second question, but you sort of went into it already.
Right.
So I'm just going to ask you a bunch of things around what you said already. Can you gave the prime example of Halevi, which is the most pronounced one, but could you also let our viewers know what other kind of proto-Kabbalistical elements were around and extent at the time besides Halevi? I would say something like Sefer Yetzirah.
Oh, well, for sure. Well, okay, and now I understand the question.
Yeah. I mean, like, what other things were floating around at those times that can be considered part of what the Rambam was trying to uproot?
Okay.
Besides
Well,
Halevi's ideas.
Yeah, there's it's an important scholarly question. It's also a Jewish question. About the nature of a series of texts which we call Sifrut Echalot literature. These are texts which aren't actually they were known to the Hasidei Ashkenaz in the Middle Ages, and very little known before them and after them. And these are texts which allegedly reflect the views of Tanaim and Amoraim. There are very few places in the Talmud where these issues are sort of like hinted at, like the whole story of Arba Nichnasu Pardes, 4 entered the mystical garden with Rabbi Akiva ben Zoma ben Azai and Elisha ben Abuya. That's one of the few places where it comes up in the Talmud. But if the Hechalot were actually written by, or if the people who quoted there are actually Tanaim and Amoraim, then certainly Judaism has an element that is involved with that. Rambam himself quotes a text called Shiur Koma, which it quotes it. He's a young man, but he's an older man. He says, "I never for a moment believed this was a serious text." So that's something people can play with. But Shiur Kabbalah describes God's physical body in amazingly exaggerated terms. But the most important text is one Rambam never knew about, and namely Zohar.
Mm-hmm.
My wife I married a nurse and discovered I was married to a librarian at one point. And she came from Long Island, by the way.
Oh, really?
Instead, yeah. In any event, so I like to take the library example. I knew her as a librarian more than I knew her as a nurse, I think. In any event, the library at the University of Haifa has a lot of Jewish books, and they're arranged according to the cataloging system of the Library of Congress. And according to that system, you have books which belong to rabbinic literature and books which belong to medieval literature. Where do you put the Zohar?
Medieval.
I'm not asking you a question, right?
Rhetorical.
I know you know the answer. But the people around Rambam, or a little bit later on, once they discovered the Zohar, those who thought it was authoritative and authentic, thought it should be shelved with the rabbinic literature. Now, if Rambam had lived another 100 years and had seen the Zohar, he would have said, well, it should be shelved with science fiction. But if we can't put it there, we should at least put it with contemporary medieval literature. So then there are other books that were floating around, Sefer Bahir, for example, Sefer Yetzirah, you mentioned, a lot of books which were floating around, and we don't really know who wrote them, where, and when. But they were all books which can be characterized as mystical and later on as Kabbalistic or as sources for Kabbalah. But you ask, I can't point to texts or books. My argument is that Rambam was fighting against things which had not yet crystallized into literature. There's the notion of the hyper-particularistic view of what a Jew is, the notion of a Jewish soul, the notion of Hebrew as a natural or divine language, the idea of what prophecy consists in, the idea of what angels are. I don't remember the other things that come up in the book, but these were all ideas that were floating around that he felt the need to fight against.
It was kind of
it was the underground.
It was the underground, but it was the common people were kind of assuming these concepts, and kind of their service of God was in this fashion.
I assume that that's the case, yes. But let's be fair to the common people, of whom we are, all of us, by the way. But
for sure,
being a Rambamian Jew is hard. It makes demands of you, many demands, and doesn't offer you comfort. And the way in which the knowledge that if you buy into, let's take a contemporary example, okay? The Ashkenazi, so-called Lithuanian and Hasidic yeshiva world, but mostly the Lithuanian yeshiva world, buys into a book called Nefesh HaChaim by Chaim Volosner, the student of the Gra. Now, according to this book, Jews learn Torah, i.e. Gemara in Yiddish. That's the idea of what learning Torah is to a very great extent, especially 6 Masechtot. In any event, and when you do that, you accomplish things in the world.
And the upper worlds.
Exactly. Why do you accomplish things in the world? Because you're affecting the upper worlds.
Correct.
And that affects this world.
Precisely. It's theurgical.
Right. Now, that's very comforting. That means that shall we say, someone who works in the garment district in Midtown Manhattan and davens mincha with Kavanah has a greater impact on the universe than Putin and Zelensky and Biden together. They operate on a very thin, superficial level, whereas the guy from the garment district who's davening mincha, losing time from work in order to daven mincha, is actually affecting but through his work on the upper levels, he's affecting what goes on in this world.
Correct.
I heard someone told me that the first Lubavitcher Rebbe was asked, why did God allow Napoleon to function? And the answer was, so we would have marches to sing to.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if that's a true story or not, but it reflects this idea that what the Goyim do is like unimportant in the final analysis. What's important is Jews fulfilling mitzvot, because that's what really keeps the world going. And I don't think Rambam held that. He thought it was important to fulfill the mitzvot, but I don't think he thought they had any kind of mystical or magical or supernal or whatever words you want impact on the world. They had a lot of look. Clearly, Rambam felt that a person who keeps the mitzvot is a better human being than someone who doesn't. And a society of people who keep the mitzvot is a better society. And that such a society has a greater chance of making possible human beings to reach their real level of perfection, which is understanding the truth.
So actually, what you mentioned before regarding Shir Koma, Rambam, he said you should burn this book. So
he didn't say you should burn it, he just says it's nonsense.
Get rid of it. Get rid of it. It's nonsense. So the same thing. Can you elaborate a little bit on the Zohar for the people who don't understand, the history of it and how it was quote unquote revealed by Moshe de Leon and what exactly happened there? Because what true historians will point out is that Rambam actually just lit the match that set all these Kabbalistic movements in motion.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I think that's the ironic consequence of Rambam's austere, demanding vision of Judaism.
It causes a reaction.
The reaction was to take things which I believe were sort of like bubbling underground. I mean, I don't know for a fact, but that seems more likely than that Moshe de Leon out of nowhere, created all this whole world of thought, especially since you might say the Zohar structure reflects a philosophical school called Neoplatonism, which also impacted a lot on the Rambam. So these ideas were all over the place. So the Zohar is not a book; it's a collection of texts, which didn't coalesce into a book until it was printed for the first time. I'm not good with dates, but I think obviously after 1460, the invention of printing, but sometime in the early 1500s, it was printed. And it's like the Gemara. People cite the Zohar according to page numbers from that edition. So there was that edition which created, in fact, made it into a book. There's a lot of scholarship about that. Not that I'm really too interested in the details, but people whom I know and respect are learning a lot these days about how the Zohar became coalesced into a physical entity that you can put on a shelf. And the Zohar is not a work which has any kind of system. It's not a systematic work.
Correct.
It's a kind of, to a very great extent, a kind of midrash. Either stories or expositions and extrapolations from verses in the Bible. Also stories about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his friends and colleagues and students. The world of the Zohar, if I may speak in just grandiose terms, is a very non-Maimonidean world.
Yep.
I'm about to get into a lot of trouble. My daughter is a non-Maimonidean. Her room is a colossal mess. Rambam is a strong believer in a place for everything and everything in its place. He was also a strong believer in monotheism. He did not like this idea of a world in which there were all kinds of levels between us and God, and sort of mediating. Recently, a very important Queens rabbi, Rabbi Simcha Kraus, passed away. He was living here in Yerushalayim, in Israel, for a long time. And once at his house, I learned something very interesting, which I should have known. He refused to sing the third verse of the Sabbath Eve hymn, Shalom Aleichem.
I also don't. I also
Okay.
Same.
So I learned this from Rabbi Krauss Shalom, that it says Barchuni l'Shalom. You address angels and ask them to bless you. And the Rambam would say that's a violation of one of the 13 principles of faith, where all prayer is addressed only to God. You don't turn to intermediate things. So the Zohar is a world full of angels who can affect what we do and whom we should propitiate or appeal to. And it's a world full of demons who can do us damage. And that we have to work carefully so that they don't damage us. So in effect, it's an enchanted world. It's a messy world, like my daughter's room.
I can't.
Here, luckily, she'll never listen to this podcast.
Okay, good. Later, these ideas of demons and angels, it got morphed into the tzaddik. That's in the Chassidut. These things kind of got sanitized a little bit, and it kind of became more about the tzaddik, right? So the tzaddik can save you, can help you, can
Right.
bring you towards God. So
It's a kind of is a pipe leading between God and you. Yeah. It's not Rambam. It's up to you.
Now I have a
Rambam
question
is
about
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, wait, so I wanted to ask you, because you're talking about the reaction to the Rambam, which led to the crystallization of mysticism. But you make a point in your book that the Rambam had a silent way of going about his critiques on these things,
Right. Yes.
which is interesting to me, because the Rambam, you highlight how the Rambam was silent about it in a way, how he kind of, everything was kind of subtle, right?
So,
Yet
absolutely.
the reaction was so strong. I'm just wondering how you put that together.
Well, I guess the answer is he wasn't subtle enough.
Okay. It was subtle. I mean, he tried. I guess you would say he tried to be subtle about it, but it didn't
It was
go
so obvious. I think it was fairly obvious what he was doing. Yeah.
And
Look, Rambam was not. My wife likes to tell me every time I go teach about Rambam, which is like all the time, she says, remember to tell the students he was also a rabbi.
Yeah.
Not just a philosopher.
Correct.
Rambam took his role and job as the leading Jew of his day seriously. If he had put his positions out not subtly, he would have undermined a lot of Jewish practice. That's why I think he wrote esoterically in the guide. Not to, Leo Strauss thinks that Rambam and other people like him wrote esoterically to protect themselves from the masses, some of the rabbis, basically. But no, I think Rambam wrote esoterically to protect the masses from him.
Mm-hmm.
A very clear-cut example is as follows. I am convinced, and not alone, I mean, this is a standard scholarly understanding of Rambam, that there is no tit-for-tat reward and punishment. We go to shul on the Yamim Noraim, and we say endless prayers, which, in effect, we present God as a kind of divine accountant, keeping track of our good deeds and our bad deeds, weighing them up, etc. Okay, that for Rambam is like baby Judaism. When we do something right, it's good for us. If we do something bad, it's bad for us and bad for our society. But it's not as if you do something bad and God will write it down and later on will get back at you, throw a thunderbolt or something. The Mishnah says in Avot, schar mitzvah mitzvah, schar vera vera, that the reward for a good deed is a good deed, and the punishment for an evil deed is an evil deed. I think that's a good way of expressing Rambam's view. But if, let's say he went into his neighborhood shul there in Cairo and said to people, please keep the mitzvot, but don't expect to be rewarded for it in any fashion. What would happen?
Nobody would do it.
Nobody would keep the mitzvot, right? But he was a rabbi. He wasn't just a philosopher. And he thought that keeping the mitzvot was good for those people. Good for him, good for society, good for the world. A society ruled by Halakha, not only does Rambam say this, I think he's right, is more often than not a just society. I offend him?
Well, he's grabbing a book, I think.
Yeah,
I'm just kidding. So that's why Rambam, his esotericism is a function of his desire to protect the simple Jew, whose Judaism is much better than nothing. Now, it would be better if all Jews were philosophers, but Rambam was smart enough to know that wasn't going to happen until the days of the Messiah, Yemot HaMashiach. That was his definition of Yemot HaMashiach, that we would all be philosophers. In effect, he didn't put it that way, okay? So, do you remember what question I'm answering?
We synthesized the first and second question, so it's actually
Okay,
as if you answered two questions. What I wanted to ask you on this with Halakha and reward, I was trying to find my Sefer Mada, but I think it's upstairs. I believe in Yesodei Torah, if I'm not mistaken, the third or fourth parak. I believe it's the fourth, but I could be wrong. Towards the end, he talks about how one should not be mitayel bepardes. You familiar with that? And
Yeah,
then
sure.
says, yeah. So
It's chapter 4, Halakha Yud Gimel.
oh, thank you. Okay.
How's that to say? No one's going to go check me, right? So
I didn't have to go. Okay. So he talks about that, and then he talks about how and for the masses, right? They have Gemara and they have Talmud, right? And they have, in a sense, I don't remember if he actually says the word halakha, but there's an implication that the Talmud and halakha, and then he says, is their path to Olam Haba. If I'm not, I was trying to find the exact words.
Yeah.
That's why I went to look for it, but you probably recall it.
Not precisely, although I have it right here if you want me to go look for it. But the point of that text is, Rambam at the end of chapter 2 says everything we've discussed in this is Maaseh Merkaba, I think he says.
Yeah. And
then chapters 3 and 4 are Maaseh Bereshit.
Yeah.
Which are code words in Rambam's view for metaphysics and physics.
Mm-hmm.
This he says explicitly in many, many places, including in the introduction to the guide, including the introduction to part 3 of the guide, in his commentary on Chagiga, chapter 2, Mishnah Aleph. This is not secret, okay? So in effect, he's asking, and then he goes on there in that halakha to say that these two issues, Maaseh Bereshit and Maaseh Merkaba, are what Chazal called a davar gadol, a great issue.
Correct.
And Havayot Abaye and Rava, the controversies between two rabbinic sages, Abaye and Rava, are what the rabbis called davar katan.
Yeah. Okay.
In his magisterial work, Introduction to the Code of Maimonides, Yitzhak Twersky says that Rambam makes this point, he says, with crushing literalism. He literally says, Talmudic discussions are davar katan, and the philosophical issues in Maaseh Bereshit, Maaseh Merkaba are davar gadol. However, he says, one should not begin with these philosophical issues before one has filled his belly, he says, with bread and meat being halachot.
Correct.
Now,
and then he follows that. He follows that with one other point. He brings Olam Haba. That's
I don't recall that precisely, but it could be. But it doesn't make any difference because he thinks that whatever he says, he thinks that, and this is clearly the case. He thinks that Olam Haba is a function of achieving a level of intellectual perfection.
Right. That's why I'm asking the question.
Yeah.
That's exactly what
he says. They are prerequisites to establish a world in which we can hope to, now I'm interpreting, okay?
I understand.
In which we hope to achieve Olam Haba, but he doesn't say that
not necessarily that itself.
In order to, he certainly feels that way. Rambam is very strong on the issue that a prerequisite for intellectual perfection is moral perfection. He didn't think you could be a great scientist or a great philosopher and being a disgusting human being. Albert Einstein was, by all accounts, a great physicist, but he was not a great family man. Martin Heidegger is thought of as the greatest philosopher of the 20th century, European philosopher of the 20th century. He was a Nazi. So for Rambam, this could not be. A prerequisite for any kind of intellectual perfection is moral perfection. And for Jews, that's the best way to do that. Not the only way, but the best way is through the Halakha. And therefore, that is why it is a tool. Now I want to get to a very important point. Here we see reflected an extremely important point in Rambam's views. Halakha is a tool, not an end in itself. And like any tool, it's judged by how effective it is in achieving its end. So halakha is a very effective tool. But as a tool, it could be changed. Obviously, it was changed. I mean, it could have been different, is what I mean to say, with the example we had of shatnez. So for Rambam, sure, study Gemara, study halakha, learn it well, so that you can move on. That's not what he says literally in that text, but that's what he means.
That's your interpretation of what he's saying.
That's what he has to mean to be consistent with 10 other places in his.
I understand. So in order to make that part of the Mishnah Torah make sense with a lot of other things he says in the Moreh or letters or whatever, that's how you would have to understand it.
Also in the previous four, look, the very fact that he says that Havayot Abaye Harava, the discussions between these rabbinic sages, is a davar katan, small thing, as opposed to studying physics and metaphysics, which is a great thing, shows that I'm not forcing this interpretation upon him. You do the small thing in order to bring yourself to the great thing.
Right. It's a logical deduction.
It's a prerequisite. Yeah. Again, this is an important point, and here I'm speaking of purely, everything I've said to this point is obviously true. Smile, okay? But it reflects my, look, I'm sure you've heard this joke 1,000 times. Why is Rambam called Maimonides in English? Because everyone has Maimonides, your Maimonides, her Maimonides.
Oh, yeah.
It's Benji's favorite
line.
That's
my favorite line, yeah. I say it all the time.
You've been hearing Maimonides, all right?
Yeah.
Now, Maimonides is not like often outer space or something. It's fairly standard, fairly conservative, a small c, interpretation of Rambam, at least in the academic world. Go much more radical than I feel is correct. I have no idea where I was going with that. But in any event, no, I'm sorry. I had a brilliant idea, but it just left me.
It's okay.
It might come back as we go on.
Yeah.
So,
all right. Sorry. Yeah. Hey, back. I think Rambam is committed to a view which he wouldn't like. That a halakha is obligatory upon Jews, but it's not necessary to become a perfect human being. And he's committed to that because of his views. Namely, halakha is a tool which enables you to lead a moral life in a moral society. But does that mean that people outside of the halakhic world can't be moral? Obviously, he didn't think that. Because he thought that Aristotle had reached a level of perfection at the very, very verge of becoming a prophet. So he had to think that Aristotle was a moral human being. He obviously didn't know much about Aristotle the man. But he was committed to the idea that Aristotle, Al-Farabi, his friend Al-Afdal, all these other people whom he admired, could not have been immoral, otherwise they couldn't have been such great philosophers. So I think he is committed to a view that, whereas he's certainly in favor of Jews fulfilling the mitzvot, he can't say that without that, no Jew can get into Olam Haba. Now this solves for him an important problem, I think, which he wasn't aware of. You ever heard of the winnowing of hell? It's a Christian term. Christians ask, what happened to all the people in the world who lived before Jesus? They had no chance of salvation. And so the answer is that Jesus went to hell and found all the people who would have believed in him had he existed in his day.
Retroactive justice.
That's right. That's called the winnowing of hell. So if you think that the only way to achieve Olam Haba is through mitzvot, then what happens to the entire universe of human beings? You know, I think the number of Jews alive today doesn't even come to a statistical error in the Chinese census.
Right.
I think anyone who thinks that the only way to achieve some kind of what we would call Olam Haba, what the Christians would call salvation, what other religions have other names for, if you think the only way to do that is through Kiyum Mitzvot, you're condemning the vast majority of humanity. You left out.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure that Rambam worried about that, but it's an issue that particularists should be worried about.
Mm-hmm. And he solved that. He solved that issue without knowing, obviously.
I think so. I think that's, because if the criterion, now remember, the criterion for Olam Haba for him is hyper. I didn't make this point yet. He was a super intellectual elitist. Say yes.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, his elitism was connected to his universalism. In other words, the elite doesn't have to be Jewish. You know, like Yehuda Levi distinguished the world like this. Over here are Jews, over here is everybody else. Okay? Now, he thought everybody else could be good people. But they still certainly are like supet, whatever the word is in English. Secondary. Now, Levi divided the Rambam divided the world this way. Up here is intellectually perfected, and down here is everybody else. Now, the intellectually perfected don't have to be Jews. Many of them would be, because he thought the Torah leads to that. But he was not committed to the idea that only Jews were in that level. Now, if you were to ask me which of Rambam's many views I reject, that would be one of them. I don't think the Jewish tradition, as I know it and love it and grew up in it, and as it developed to our day, was elitist in that fashion.
Mm-hmm.
But, even Rambam was allowed to be wrong.
For sure.
Okay.
You want to take the next one?
Yes. So, segueing off of that large intro, we wanted to talk about the concept of holiness. Holiness has become a buzzword in Judaism today. We use this word loosely and without much thought going into its actual meaning. Today, we attach it to people, places, and objects with a sort of assumed intrinsic quality. In the time of the Rambam, this mistranslation as holiness was a widespread phenomenon. As an idea he tried to refine. Can you please explain what holiness meant in the Rambam's time and how he polemicized against these sorts of conceptions?
Well, I think that you've phrased it very well. Again, it's easiest to take the example of Yehuda Levi because he was very smart and very non-Maimonidean. So for him, holiness is a characteristic. It's out there. In other words, Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, is holy. Brooklyn is not. The North Shore of Long Island even is not. It's only the land of Israel. And within the land of Israel, Jerusalem is holier than the rest of the land of Israel, etc. I don't want to offend any of you people listening to this podcast, but not even Brooklyn is holy. So it's important to realize that Rambam denies there's such a thing as intrinsic holiness. There are no holy places, there are no holy objects, there are no holy people. There is only, he was a real rabbi, there is only halakha. Halakha tells us to treat certain places differently than other places. And some of that is a reflection of history. Now, he himself, look, Rambam was, couldn't get away from certain things that we're all used to. So he doesn't think that it was an accident that Eretz Yisrael is called the Holy Land. But his holiness consists of the fact that there are mitzvot tafliot ba'aretz. There are mitzvot that can only be obeyed there. Look, Chazal tell us, rabbis of the Talmud tell us that when the temple was destroyed in the year 70 of the Common Era by the Romans, God's presence left. First, it left the Holy of Holies, and it left the Temple Mount, then it left Jerusalem. Now, Rambam doesn't say that anywhere, but he wouldn't object to saying that as a kind of midrashic, agadic expression. But to take it seriously is to make the mistake of localizing God. God cannot be localized. And it's making the mistake of seeing some kind of geographical entity as intrinsically distinct from and superior to other geographical entities. Let's take tefillin, okay? We are enjoined to treat tefillin with great respect. There are halachot about it. But there's nothing about the physical objects which makes them holy, aside from the halachot about them. So you can't talk about a holy person in the way in which a lot of Jews today would like to talk about it.
Correct.
You can talk about a righteous person, a smart person, a wonderful person, a person with great midot, personal characteristics. And you might want to use holiness as a kind of shorthand, but you have to realize it's just a shorthand. That's another human being. Now, if this human being behaves in the way human beings ought to behave, i.e., morally perfect, intellectually sound, that person deserves a certain amount of respect that other people would get less of. But there's nothing intrinsic about that person.
So what do we
The
mean?
idea that Hasidic leaders are tzaddikim and they're distinct from their followers, he would reject entirely.
What do we mean? What does the Torah mean when it says Hashem is holy?
Well, that I think it's very simple to. First of all, the pasuk says "Kedoshim to you, ki kadosh ani."
Kedoshani. What do those words mean? Because it has to be symmetrical to us in terms
whatever
of
they mean.
Yes.
Is something that we can aspire to.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Rambam says explicitly that the meaning of that pasuk is fulfill the mitzvot. That pasuk is a very good example of how to understand Rambam versus almost everybody else. Most Jews over the last 800 years would say, Kedoshim to you, be holy, is a promise. You will be holy. In other words, the Hebrew is taken as being in the future tense.
Oh, Kedoshim to
clearly
you,
sees it.
Gotcha.
Rambam clearly sees it in the imperative tense. Sivui, be holy. In that sense, try to imitate God. What does it mean, be holy? Behave in a certain fashion. It doesn't mean you will become holy like God is holy. That's ridiculous. There's no way that God and human beings can share any aspect, any characteristic.
Quality of holiness.
Quality, exactly. That would be total idolatry in Rambam's eyes.
Yeah. I think holiness is also like a soiled term from Christianity, because in the traditional Jewish sense, it means to be separated, right? To be separate.
Sure, right.
God is, it actually makes sense in that context that Hashem is transcendent, and we must also kind of separate ourselves from the other nations, and in our practices we have to separate the weekday from Shabbat, and it's all about
sanctification.
Right, it's about sanctification of things. It doesn't mean that those things are intrinsically holy as we understand it today, but it really just means that there's distinctions between God and the world, and us and certain things that we do.
Very well said.
Absolutely.
Very well said.
You're good Maimonideans.
We're trying.
Yeah.